What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, and on this episode, we're going to recap Week 1 in Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse. I'll give you my thoughts on that here in just a moment as we start out the show. A little bit later on, we'll get back into some discussion about how pro lacrosse in specific is really starting to drive the growth of the sport all over the place here in America, Canada, and all around the world, really. And then later on, we got some news here this Monday morning on Chris Hogan, so we'll get to that to round out the show. If you haven't heard yet, I'll talk about that and what specifically is going on there. But to jump right in to this episode here on a Monday on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, I said I was going to give you my Week 1 thoughts on Athletes Unlimited. We talked about it a bit on Thursday's show last week. I previewed a little bit of what the league is about and kind of what we can expect going into the weekend. But now coming out of Week 1 in Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse, I think we have a much bigger, broader picture of what this league is, how it's going to be played out, and really just how exciting I think this league is going to be here over the next few weeks. But for just kind of my general impression, I was very impressed with what we saw this weekend. I thought the on-field product was highly competitive and energetic at both ends of the field. I thought the goalie play especially was fantastic as well. The offense, no shortage of offense either for any of these teams here this past weekend. And really in that regard, the average score differential, just to kind of give you guys an idea of how closely competitive and how tight these games were, the average score differential over the 5 games this weekend was 3.2 goals. So that's within 2 possessions on average, and 3 of the 5 were within 2 goals, so even tighter than the average this weekend. So that's how close these games really were for the most part this weekend. And I thought the style of play more closely resembled the men's game, being that it's 6-on-6, and that's something that they talked about on the broadcasts this weekend is those differences, and now kind of making it a more open game, trying to get up and down the field a little bit more. But I thought the broadcast itself was absolutely phenomenal in the product that they were putting out from a broadcast standpoint, because I loved having the players mic'd up on the field so you could listen into that when they came back from commercial breaks and things like that, seeing how the players communicated with each other throughout these games. I also thought the under the helmet interviews, much like what we see with the Premier Lacrosse League, I thought the under the helmet interviews with the goalies was a lot of fun as well, because these players have such great personalities, and doing those kinds of things where you get to listen into them talking on the field and the way that they communicate with each other, like I said, just really brings you that much closer to the game, to the product on the field, and really gives you a sense of who these athletes are and the way that they communicate with each other on the field. But also just the broadcasters themselves. Joe Beninati is absolutely fantastic calling these games, and Courtney Martinez Connor was I think really good calling the action along with him. I thought they definitely worked really well together and just made the games more interesting to watch and to listen to, and really helped you understand what it is that Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse is and how it's played. And I think for a casual fan, made it a lot easier to understand not only the league but the sport itself. And again, the product on the field was just so much fun to watch this weekend. But I think that the two of them, Beninati and Connor, definitely made it just that much more interesting and that much more electric. And I said it on Thursday's episode, if you remember back to Thursday's episode, the best way that I can describe Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse is real live fantasy sports, because I mentioned in one of the episodes last week regarding the Premier Lacrosse League and getting involved in fantasy lacrosse that something I wanted to see them do with that when they do eventually add fantasy lacrosse is possibly adding stuff to their broadcast that updates as the game goes along, so you can see players' game totals as far as goals, assists, things like that, but also including what those fantasy values would be as the game goes along as well, is something that I talked about last week. And that's something that when you look at Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse, that's something that in a sense they did this weekend, and I think something that we can expect to see from them moving forward is that as the individual player points were added throughout the games, whether it was for goals, assists, saves, ground balls, whatever they did individually to earn themselves those points, they updated them in real time as the game went along, and they would show a graphic on the screen showing you where the players ranked in terms of overall individual points, because as we talked about, those top 4 individual point earners each weekend become the next week's team captains and get to draft their new teams every Monday night. And you can watch that tonight on Facebook Live, I believe. But it was just really interesting to see that something that I had just talked about a week ago was something that they were actually able to include because of the fact that they have those individual points that they utilize with Athletes Unlimited and the way that they run their league. So I thought that was a very interesting and very creative touch to the broadcast as well. But the rules, as I kind of touched on last week, are designed to create a more fast-paced flow of the game. They play 6-on-6, which again is more closely resembling the men's game, and they removed the shooting space and dangerous shot rules from the women's game with this league, so that, and it's something that we see in the college game a lot, but it allows these athletes to be able to play without causing too many stoppages because of free positions and things like that, because of having to call all this body contact. But it allows these athletes to get up and down the field to make plays and not have to worry about being too physical, being too fast, too aggressive when even just going for a ground ball, let's say. But it really allows them to open things up and to play at such a high and energetic level all the time, and just be able to get after it and really create that high energy level of competition that we saw this weekend, because it really limits the number of free positions and creates that more 6-on-6 game flow where you're getting up and down the field and allowing them to just go out and make plays, because that's really what makes the game so interesting, is when you have those opportunities to go out and make plays like that. And really, the only time we saw a penalty or free position was when someone clearly basically got their head taken off, right? Like when somebody goes up high, even if it was accidental, and you couldn't ignore the fact that they got hit on the head or above the shoulders, let's say. So when it was something that was very clear and obvious, that's when we saw them make that stoppage and say, okay, this is going to be a yellow card, or okay, we're going to line it up and have a free position opportunity. But other than that, they really allowed these players to just go out and make plays. And Marie McCool netted the first 2-pointer in Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse history off a free position. I believe it was in a game on Saturday. And the play that she made was actually a very heady play when you go back and look at it, as I watched the replay of that game on Sunday night. But the way she did it, and being able to think the way that she did in that situation, was actually a very heads-up move on the part of Marie McCool, because she lines up at the free position arc, where if you shoot from behind that in this league, in Athletes Unlimited, it's a 2-point goal, just like you see the 2-point arc in the PLL. So normally what they'll do is they'll start where they're towing the line of that arc on a free position, and then they might step in and take a shot, whatever. And in that situation, that would be a 1-point goal. What Marie McCool did was she said, okay, I'm going to take a few steps back from that arc, so that when I take my 2-step little crow hop in to shoot, I'm still going to be just a few inches behind that line. So when I let it go, it's going to be a 2-pointer. So she takes a couple steps back, she lets it fly, and she gets it to go. And what was so interesting, and why this was such a big play at that point in the game, was because her team, each quarter, your team can win that quarter based on score for that 8 minutes of play, and you get points towards your individual total. I believe it's 20 points per player if your team wins that quarter by score. Her team was down, I believe, 3-1 in that quarter at the time before she hit that 2-pointer. So that tied the quarter score, which then pushed those individual points into the third quarter, the next quarter in that situation. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, her team may have taken those points in that situation. I could be wrong, but whoever it was that won the points in that situation got points for the second quarter and the third quarter towards their individual totals. So that was just a very heads up play by Marie McCool. And as I said, the first ever 2-point shot, or excuse me, 2-point goal, I should say, in Athletes Unlimited lacrosse history. So a comment that I got from this weekend on Twitter, at Stevie Mac Media is my Twitter handle, from Brian on Twitter, says, great opening weekend. The new rules made the game so much faster pace. The player points updating in real time was a great touch. I really like the point system as it gives defenders and goalies equal opportunity to gross points, and the social media team did a great job as well. Yeah, I mean, he basically touches here, Brian does, on everything that I kind of just said, as far as touching on the rules changes to really open things up and make it a much more faster flow of the game and make it more interesting to watch. He talks about updating the individual points in real time, giving it that real life fantasy sports feel to it. And again, he says the point system is designed to give every player, every position group an equal opportunity to be a part of that top 4 group in terms of individual points, to then be able to be the following week's team captains based on individual points. So yeah, I thought this was a very, very good opening weekend for Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse, and really just shows you, like I said on Thursday's episode, really shows you where the sport of lacrosse is going, and I think really where professional sports in general, I think, will be in the next few years. But lacrosse is really at the forefront of that movement. So my final thoughts from this week in Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse, week 1 in the history of Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse, is that for me, as a women's lacrosse broadcaster myself at the collegiate level, I really enjoyed what Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse is doing with the women's game. Again, changing those rules to make the flow of the game a lot easier to consume as a viewer, leading to less stoppages especially, and allowing the athletes to play and be physical without having to call every little bit of contact that we see a foul. Because for me, when I'm calling games, I've called games in the past where they would call, and I kid you not, almost every single bit of contact between players, they would call that a foul, or they would bring out a yellow card, or whatever the case may be, depending on the situation of play. And that just leads to so many stoppages, to where it really just derails any sort of momentum within the flow of the game. And it actually got to a point where I've called games in the past where they would call the foul, the referees would get together, discuss the call that they made, and in doing so take several minutes to discuss it, then come out and decide, okay, yes, we got the call right originally. And I get them wanting to make sure they got the call right, but to do that on every single one of their calls seemed a bit ridiculous. And then to come out and say, okay, now we can do the free position, like we're ready to go. And then they would actually reset the entire free position setup that the players had done. So that took even more time. So just, again, absolutely derailing any kind of momentum that the game could have had at that point. But that's something that, like I said, that's something that you don't see with Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse. It's, hey, we're going to go out, we're going to allow these athletes to play. If they get a little chippy, if things get a little bit rough, then we'll decide when we want to make a call or not. But unless the players, down on the ground holding a body part, clearly writhing in pain, we're just going to let them play, right? We're not going to stop the momentum. We're going to let them play. We're going to let them be a little bit physical, and we're going to just let this thing kind of play itself out. We're not going to let the officials have that much control over the game. We're going to let it come down to the players making plays on the field. So when we come back, I said at the top of the show, I want to get into how pro lacrosse, just a little bit, how pro lacrosse is really growing the game. And spoiler alert here as we get into segment 2, a lot of that is going to come from the streaming that these pro leagues are now able to do with their broadcast. But we'll get to that in segment 2 in just a moment. You're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back. Segment 2 of the show, Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. I said before the break I was going to get into touching a little bit on how pro lacrosse is really growing the game and the sport of lacrosse as a whole, not just at the pro level, but in general across the U.S., even including Canada as well, and really making it more worldwide, I guess you could say. Because we see it all the time on lacrosse Twitter, people saying to grow the game. There's even, I think, a hashtag grow the game that's been going around as of late. And I really think that these pro leagues are actually making a lot of headway as far as being able to grow the game and make it more accessible for people of all age groups and demographics and things like that. And I said before the break, a little bit of a spoiler alert here is that a lot of that has to do with broadcasting the games, streaming the games, and making it more accessible to watch, as well as making it more accessible for people to play, which is where I think things like speed lacrosse, if you've ever played speed lacrosse, things like that definitely makes it more accessible to play as well because of the lack of equipment needed in order to do so. But just kind of breaking down here really quick how I kind of think some of these pro leagues that we see now are making the game more accessible, more, I think, enjoyable for even a casual fan to be a part of. The PLL, I think, the way that they use social media to interact with their fans and really being the first, I think, to do the mic'd up interviews, especially the under the helmet interviews that they do with players live in the middle of games, is definitely something that I think more pro sports leagues and sports such as, you know, NFL, MLB, things like that they will get more involved with here in the future. But again, that's something that lacrosse, I think, has really made more available to these other sports and other leagues, and saying, yeah, this is what we're doing. How have you never thought of this type of a thing? So I think it's really opened people's eyes to what other pro sports leagues can do in terms of things like that. But again, lacrosse being the first ones to really bring that out, I think was a big thing for the sport and for the PLL in general. But again, like I said, with streaming and the broadcasts as a whole, the broadcasts deal with NBC Sports and Peacock in this situation regarding the Premier Lacrosse League, really puts the game on a major platform, allowing more people to watch. And when more people are watching, that's going to be a positive thing for the league and for the sport itself, as far as growing the game, which is what we talk about and what really this segment is about. And then you look at Athletes Unlimited, changing the rules of the women's game to make the game faster paced and more exciting to watch, and allowing their athletes to go make plays even through contact at times, and just not trying to stifle their ability to get up and down the field and make plays, and also hindering the flow of the game as well. Changing those rules to allow them to do that, I think, has been a very positive thing, even just after 1 week in Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse. But also using the individual point system, resembling fantasy sports in a way, live fantasy sports like we've talked about, and even just having the weekly team drafts with the new captains every week based on those individual points. Just things like that, those innovative things that we talked about on Thursday's episode of the podcast, is really going to help bring more attention to Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse, because it's something that we've never really seen before in pro sports, let alone in the sport of lacrosse. So it's going to bring more attention to the league and to the sport of lacrosse, because it's something something that's never really been done before. So more people, I think, will be interested to see how it all works and how it plays out on the field and really what all goes into that. And even something as small as Topps creating the first ever women's lacrosse trading cards as part of Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse, I think is a really nice touch. Again, it's nothing major, but at the same time, it's never been done before for the sport of lacrosse, and especially women's lacrosse. So that's, again, just another thing that Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse is able to boast. And again, going back to the whole broadcasting and streaming thing and making games more accessible to more viewers and more fans, having the games on CBS Sports, FS1, FS2 is similar to what the PLL has with Peacock and NBC Sports, like we just said, and it'll put the sport of lacrosse on another major TV network for more eyes to see. So we're not just talking about games being on YouTube or streaming on Facebook or this or that. They're on major TV networks, major streaming networks, where hundreds of thousands, even millions of people could potentially be tuning in to watch their games because they're subscribed to Peacock, because they're subscribed to whatever, or because it's on national TV each and every weekend. And then you look at even with the NLL, it's the oldest of the 3 pro lacrosse leagues now, and it represents the box game at the pro level. So again, we talk about Athletes Unlimited and the PLL representing the pro field game, NLL doing that with the box game. And up until 2021, they had their games streamed on Bleacher Report Live. But in 2021, the NLL has since made a deal to broadcast on TSN in Canada, and I believe they have yet to announce where the broadcast and streaming will be held here in the US. But again, making the games more accessible to watch, not just here in the US, but in Canada as well, and allowing more people to access the game of lacrosse, to watch the games on TV wherever they may watch, and just getting as many people as humanly possible to the game and really showing them what it's all about is a big, big deal for this sport as we move forward. And it's something that I've talked about with guys like my buddy Phil Rothermick, who's been a guest on this show probably too many times to count at this point, but we've talked about in the past that this really is, at this point in time, the highest point that the sport of lacrosse has ever been at in its long history. But the exciting thing about that is not only is it currently at its height from where it's been in the past, but it's going to continue getting much higher from this point on. Like it's really only up from here at this point for the sport of lacrosse, and really the pro level has a lot to do with the elevation of the sport moving forward. And like I said, you're seeing that with what the PLL's done. You're seeing that with what Athletes Unlimited has done and what the NLL has done over the course of their history. And when you look at specifically with the PLL and Athletes Unlimited in terms of their broadcasts and those that are actually in charge of calling the games, I think the PLL with Brennan Burke and Ryan Boyle on the call for their games are absolutely fantastic. I love tuning in to watch the games and listen to those guys call the action and all the excitement that the league has to offer us each and every game every weekend in the summer. And when you look at Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse, having Joe Beninati, who is a longtime MLL broadcaster, he is a true pro when it comes to calling the sport of lacrosse. I don't care if it's men's lacrosse, I don't care if it's women's lacrosse. You're going to tune in to watch him, to listen to him call the action, because he is a pro's pro when it comes to calling the sport of lacrosse. And I thought Courtney Martinez-Connor calling the games alongside him, those two really, to me, again, as a lacrosse broadcaster myself, those two did a fantastic job this weekend, really working off each other and being able to bounce the conversation back and forth throughout the course of a game, and just being able to, again, feed off each other and to elevate the product that we were watching, and being able to add to that excitement was really, I think, a great thing for Athletes Unlimited and the sport of women's lacrosse. And I really enjoyed Martinez Connor calling the games and the insight that she was able to add to the broadcast, and really did a great job, I think, breaking down all the action and making the game easier, especially with the things that we've talked about Athletes Unlimited Lacrosse does with some of the unique innovations that they have. She did a really good job of breaking all that down and making the game easier for the casual fan to understand, because somebody like you or me could understand it pretty easily just by watching it. But if a person who doesn't really know much of lacrosse and specifically the women's game, if they don't really know what's going on, it was nice having people like Joe Beninati and Courtney Martinez Connor there to explain it to you in a way that I think a novice could really understand. So we got one more thing I want to get to with this episode real quick as we get to another break. Chris Hogan possibly eyeing an NFL return. I'll talk about that in just a moment, but you're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back. Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, final segment of the show here on a Monday. I said before the break, we're going to talk about some Chris Hogan. We have some news with Chris Hogan here on this Monday morning. And the news is that he could potentially be eyeing a return to the NFL. So Hogan, as we all know, played collegiate lacrosse at Penn State back around 2009, 2010 before transferring to Monmouth to play football with his final year of college eligibility, and then went on to play several years in the NFL, even becoming a Super Bowl champion with the Patriots not that long ago. And then he decides to give lacrosse another go, joining the Premier Lacrosse League as a free agent back in the spring of 2021. And he gets picked up by the Cannons, as we all know, from watching the PLL and following the PLL. And after only appearing in one game of their first 5, he gets traded to the Whip Snakes, and at this point, he's only appeared in one game with Jim Stagnita's club, the very first game, in fact, since he got traded to the Whip Snakes. But reports came out on Monday morning that the New Orleans Saints will be bringing him in for a workout at wide receiver prior to training camp, because their star wide receiver, Michael Thomas, is expected to miss their first couple games of the regular season with an injury. So if Hogan returns to the NFL, he will have barely played, or I should say barely made it through, one whole season in the PLL, and in which he only played 2 total games through the first 5 weeks of the regular season. So I believe that's about 7 possible games that he could have been a part of, and he only played in 2 of them. So if you remember back, I wasn't really much of a fan of Hogan coming to the PLL, and I thought that it seemed a bit gimmicky to me at the time when the league and when Hogan announced it back in the early part of the spring. And it seemed like it was more of a promotional thing than an actual lacrosse decision. Now, whether you want to say that it was more so by Hogan or by the league in terms of the promotional stunt thing, I think that would be an interesting debate. But you also have to wonder, since Hogan did all this and possibly did it to get his name back out there with some of these NFL teams, as he now has that tryout with the Saints. But I think if Hogan does leave the PLL in favor of making his return to the NFL, it'll be interesting to see what the Whipsnakes do with that additional roster spot, who they decide to slot into that additional spot. And as we make our way towards the postseason in the PLL, I don't want this to become about Chris Hogan and whether or not he's going to stick with lacrosse or go back to the NFL, or even if he's interested in going back to the NFL. I don't want it to be about that. I want it to be about lacrosse, because that's really what this is about. It's the PLL, it's pro lacrosse. So let's make it about lacrosse and about the product on the field, as we talked about in segment 2, growing the game and bringing more attention to the sport. So let's make it about lacrosse. Let's keep it about the product on the field, and let's make it about the players who have worked so hard this season coming out of the pandemic to even make this season possible and to make it as high quality as what it's been. Because you look at the top of the PLL standings right now, it's absolutely stacked up at the top. So it'll be really interesting to see how these last 2 weeks in the regular season shake out. So let's try to focus more on that and a little less on where Chris Hogan's going to go, if he's going to stick with the PLL, if he's going to go back to the NFL, because I can't find it within me to care too much about whether or not a guy who's played a total of 2 games this year in the PLL is deciding whether or not he wants to stick around, because at this point, I think should be even grateful that he's still in the league and hasn't been cut yet, in favor of somebody who I think could have more of an impact for one of these clubs, whether it was during his time with the Cannons or now that he's with the Whip Snakes. Because believe it or not, the player pool is still absolutely loaded with lacrosse talent that I think could very easily slot in to his vacant roster spot if he does in fact make a return to the NFL here this fall. But that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this post. Also, find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including SoundCloud, Spotify, Anchor, Google, Apple Podcasts. It's also now on TuneIn and iHeartRadio as well. So again, anywhere you could possibly think to get your podcasts, you can find us there. Search Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. But I will talk to you guys later.